My talk today is, I'm going to be looking at history, and I thought this would be kind of interesting, kind of a paradox, because I'm looking at the pressures of modern life and the influence of history on the pressures of modern life. So I think it'll be kind of an interesting topic, and I've created kind of a case study that I want you to think about, and mostly I want you to think about the function of history. Because when we think of history, a lot of times we think of history as it's a documenting of the past, it's factual, it's not rhetorical, it's history. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So in thinking about the function of history, I started out by thinking about the function of history in my own life. And I'm an old Utah guy. Are most of you all from Utah? How many of you are from Utah? All right. So I'm an old Utah guy. And in my family, we have this ancestor. His name is Orson Pratt. And Orson Pratt is a pioneer. He came across the plains, and he's this guy. He's kind of thought of as a Mormon scholar. So he's a pioneer, he's a teacher, he's a scholar, he's a mathematician. Check out this book he wrote, The Key to the Universe. I never read that, but I want to read that, because that sounds like that might have some good stuff in it. But when you think about having Orson Pratt in my family on a personal level, it's really wild. Like last night I had dinner with my dad, and I mentioned this talk, and I said, I'm going to talk. He goes, what are you talking about? I said, I'm talking about Orson Pratt. And Dad gets this tear in his eye, you know, and it goes down his cheek, and he's like, Orson Pratt, isn't it amazing that he became such a great scholar with an 8th grade education? So for my dad, this idea of Orson Pratt, like I don't really know that much about Orson Pratt factually, but the idea of Orson Pratt, for my dad, gives him two things. He gives him purpose, and it also gives him a sense of importance. And so that's what happens on a personal level. Then you start thinking about that, and you expand that out, and you think about how history affects folks on a cultural level. And here's another example that also is a Utah example, because we're here in Utah. So here in Utah, we have a thing on the 24th of July called Pioneer Day. And on Pioneer Day, we have a parade. This is a picture here of the parade down on State Street. And this parade, again, like a lot of us don't know that much about pioneerism, you know, other than the idea of pioneerism. But the parade itself gives us this sense of purpose and importance, and it makes us think about our state as industrious, this wholesome culture, this hard-working culture. At least within the Mormon culture, that's what it does on a cultural level. So that's the function of history. So it functions in more than just like a recounting of facts. Okay, so then the big question that I think about with my research is what happens when that function is disrupted, when you have a major disruption in that function, and your idea of history is radically changed. How does that affect you as a person on a psychological level? And so when I started thinking about this, I looked for a case study that I could kind of study how this works, and I found this place in Belgium, the Royal Museum for Central Africa. And this museum is thought of as kind of the last colonial museum. It was built by Leopold II in 1897, and it was kind of a way for him to promote his work in the Congo, because he kind of like, as I'll show you here, kind of owned a big chunk of the Congo. So, how many of you have heard of Leopold II before? Very good. Have you read Hochschild's book, Leopold's Ghost? Anybody read that? Very good, very good. Okay. So Leopold II, like I said, he was able to purchase a big chunk of the Congo. And early on, this is how he did it. He did some maneuvering at the Berlin Conference, and he said, this is what I'm going to do in the Congo. I'm going to build roads, I'm going to build hospitals, I'm going to bring agriculture, I'm going to increase literacy. We're going to bring, quote unquote, civilization to the Congo. Okay? And in response, the way he was able to do this was the other folks at the Berlin Conference said, well, what do we get in return? And he said, free trade. We're going to have free trade. So for a long time, Leopold II was thought of as kind of this humanitarian who would brought, quote unquote, again, civilization to the Congo. Well, after today, colonization is not so looked upon so favorably, and now he's looked at as Leopold II actually, he extracted rubber out of the Congo. He was responsible for millions and millions of deaths. People compare him to Hitler. decreased the population by 60%. And I put up this picture here because he had this forceful belief. It was kind of the folks who would enforce everything. And he didn't want to waste any bullets, at least how the story goes. He didn't want to waste any bullets. So he said, if you use a bullet, I want you to bring back the hand of the carcass of the person that you used that bullet on. And so this picture on the right pictures of people who weren't killed, but the soldiers didn't want to get in trouble, so they removed the hands of people who were living in order to show that they used these bullets. So it was horrible, horrible figure. But check it out. So you got this previous slide where he's thought I was a humanitarian, and you got this second slide where he's thought I was probably one of the worst villains of all time. Okay, so now back to the RMCA, Royal Museum for Central Africa. Royal Museum for Central Africa has gone through renovations up to 2005 and after 2005. And what I did is I studied the narratives that are contained in the museum to see how those ideas were represented. And before 2005 when I went there, Leopold II was still shown as a humanitarian. I've got this statue up here. It's not a great picture, but you can kind of tell what it is. It's a picture it's called Belgium Brings Civilization to Congo. And it's got this, Congolese figure, this diminutive African there. And it's still showing colonization in this positive light. That's pre-2005. No mention of the rubber, no mention of the killing. All that other stuff is not in there. Okay, so post-2005, the displays become a little bit ambivalent, and you have two narratives going on at the same time. You got the narrative on the right, still there, that I mentioned before, but I don't know if you can tell what this picture is on the left. But the picture on the left is when the Congo received independence, the King of Belgium went over there, had a big parade, and this Congolese guy snuck up behind the car and grabbed his ceremonial sword and took it as this show of power. Like we're taking back the Congo. And so you have these two kind of narratives, one kind of pro-colonization, one anti-colonization in the same museum. And so you had this rupture that I was kind of looking for. So who are the people who are most affected by this rupture? The people who are most affected by this rupture, as part of this study, I also interviewed 50 colonists who were there, who were in the Congo up to the 60s, and now they're in their 80s, 90s, they're pretty old. But I interviewed them to see how they felt about these changes in the museum, and as you can imagine, they were pretty upset. They thought, hey, okay, we know the history, we know the facts. This picture on the left, that's not the facts. The facts are the picture on the right. And so they were really upset. So what can we learn from all this? Who's right? These are the big lessons I learned. History is rhetorical. History is always persuasive. Somebody's always making an argument, and it's always serving that function, purpose, importance. And the other idea is that history evolves. It changes over time. It's not static. And so by studying these ebbs and flows, we learn a lot about how people think about different issues like colonization. So, now, if I'm serious about this idea, if I'm really serious about this idea that history ebbs and flows, then as I start to try to publish information myself on this phenomenon, it would be kind of crazy for me to just go out and write another manuscript and say, okay, here's history, here's the history, right? Here it is published, here the editor goes through it and says everything's looking good, and I publish that thing. And again, it doesn't show any of this messiness like I saw in the museum, which is there are multiple narratives going on at the same time. So I tried to figure out a way to publish my findings with this study in a way that would show that messiness, and I came up with this thing called the Congo Project, and it's actually a website. During the break, I'll give you the address if you're interested. And the website, I divided it up into what I call tours, because they're tours through the data. So I have history tour, museum tour, theme tour, process tour, and multimedia resources. And I want to show you, I can't replicate the website, but I want to kind of show you how this works. So the first one is my history tour. And what I came up with was, instead of just using traditional links that you would have, hyperlinks to video interviews or whatever, I color-coded my links. So you can see over here on the left, any link that's in brown supports my argument. Any link that's in red counters my argument. These are like colonial veterans that are like, hey, you're crazy, Wood, that doesn't make any sense. Theory links are in purple and reflexive and definition links. And I I don't have time to show you all this stuff, but I've got a few clips here to show you how this works. So this is Joe Vandenberg. Joe Vandenberg runs a museum called the Royal Museum of Namur, and he is still under the impression that Leopold II is the greatest humanitarian of all time. So if you read through my history and you come across a link that says greatest humanitarian of all time, you're going to get this. With sound, though. To achieve his program, despite the fact that the Belgian government was rather reluctant. In all his operations, he got limited support from the government. He was a man who was fighting by his own. He had some financial support by English finance.
Now, I'm not going to play the whole thing, it's only 12 minutes, but I'll tell you this. He talks about how Leopold was able to cure sleeping sickness, how he was able to develop education, how he was able to build up the country. Now, this one, if you come across this link right here, this is a support link for my argument. This is Pete, and Pete is an interesting character. He's a city councilman in Belgium. And if you go to Belgium, the streets, there's like Leopold II Street, there's Leopold II building, there's Leopold II statues everywhere. He's like, we gotta get, if this guy's really this tyrant, we gotta get rid of this stuff. So Pete has gone through and he's tried to get a campaign going to get rid of all of these things. Okay, but here's Pete.
I am living here in the city of Blankenberg. My family was living here in the city from Blankenberg for generations. We're all fishermen. Now I am one of the last, not fishermen, but my father became sailmaker. So my whole family is here for generations.
I'm not going to say the whole thing. Like I said, I just don't have time. But he goes through and talks about this effort of how he's trying to change, for him, these public monuments so that he can show kind of, for him, this other version of history, which I thought was very interesting. So in terms of a document, scholarly document, in terms of a scholarly document, this is kind of cool because it shows this dialogue that happens, the messiness of scholarship. Okay. Now, I'm getting a little close on time, so I'm going to show you just a couple other sections here. The second tour is a museum tour. And what I did in the museum tour is I went through and I photographed every single exhibit in the museum. And I went through there and I included the text from the museum, and I also included expert testimony. I interviewed experts, and then I also took a tape recorder so I could talk about my own thoughts on each of these exhibits. So if you click on any of these links, you get, here's one, I think it's planned, but you can't see it.
Force publique. Now, this area of the museum is dealing with the force publique as it was used.
So I tried to be a little bit more reflexive in my studies. Okay. Now I'm down to about a minute here, so I want to show you one other thing.
Tout à l'heure, le chiffre de 25 000 hommes, un effectif total de la force publique au point de vue homme, mais c'est fort peu.
I think I clicked too many.
I thought they
Okay. Now the last tour, I'll show you some other tours, but you can see I tried using a different kind of method on each of these. The last one is a reflexive tour. And the reflexive tour is basically I turned the camera on myself and I talked about how I came up with the conclusions that I came up with. And so here's a video, if you go through that way, talk about
Well, I'm back at it again today. And for the past group of interviews, what I've been coding for is nostalgia.
So the idea here is a lot of times when a scholar publishes a piece, you don't really get any of that talk where they're like, ooh, I don't know, I could be wrong on this. And so that's what I tried to do with that bit, was show where I was wrong, or where I was thinking issues through. Last little bit, for this project, I include all of my resources so that other scholars can go and use the same stuff, check out my conclusions, see if they come to more conclusions, and in this way I think we change, A, the way we think about history, B, the way we represent history, and C, we can start to look at history in a more critical fashion. So, anyway, thanks so much. I appreciate you listening.